Number of things that are going to be tricky just in that first Mishnah. So we'll see how far we can get. But is it on live? Yes, good. We don't need to have infinite regression of the monitor in the background. All right. So we are on chapter 2, Mishnah 5. And there's going to be two big ideas, two big categories of ideas that we're going to have to wrestle with just to get through this Mishnah. The first one should be straightforward, but it may blow a few minds. The second one's going to be a little bit more complicated. So do I have a volunteer?
Sure.
Thanks, Julie. Everyone turns to you because you've now become the default. But I want to make sure that you do get credit as a volunteer. This isn't a job. This is a volunteer. So Mishnah 5, Part 1, as marked in the USCJ Mishnah breakdown.
Part 1. These are the things with which they fulfill their obligation on Pesach. With wheat, with barley, with spelt, with rye, and with oats.
All right. Typical Mishnah fashion. It tells us how to do something, but not what we're actually doing. Because it assumes you already know what your obligation is. So what is our obligation on Pesach that would come vis-a-vis these grains? The obligation, matzah. Okay, so the prohibition we're going to get to. But the Mishnah very carefully phrases the language in the positive. Right? There is a mitzvah to eat something on Pesach. We call it matzah. And you can only fulfill that mitzvah with matzah made from one of these 5 grains. We're on chapter 2, Mishnah 5. All right, so wheat, barley, spelt, rye, and oats. A lot of those you probably don't go around eating much of. You probably also don't go around eating them just regularly. You can buy matzah in all varieties these days. Yay, internet. Or if you live in a big Jewish city, you can find them on the shelves. But wheat, of course, is the most common. And we talked about that last week, or at least I'm sure sometime recently, about how wheat was always considered the most prized of the grains. And therefore, not just because it's tasty, but also because it is the most efficient. Wheat usually gets preference when making matzah. But that means, can I do the mitzvah of matzah with rice matzah? No. Can I do mitzvah of matzah with corn matzah, with bean matzah, with potato matzah, with any of these things made into anything like a bread? No. And that means also, to flip it lehefech, you can't violate Pesach with any of those. All right, let's make sure we understand that. If you can't do the mitzvah of matzah with the food, then you can't turn it into chametz. If it isn't mitzvah worthy, it's not chametzable. That's
okay. That's a big deal there.
Yeah, that's a big deal, right?
Because now you're defining what can qualify for matzah for the mitzvah, but also you're qualifying what is chametz.
Well, because it is one and the same. Chametz is something that has leavened. Right, and leavened in the technical sense of the word means it's come from these 5. It's leavenable if it's one of these 5 and the leavening process has begun on it. And if you haven't begun the leavening process on one of these 5, and then you eat it, it's matzah. All right, so that's how the category works. Can I help you? Thank you. So it is exactly a big deal because let's see if I can do my old Boolean logic here. All right, so this is the category of all the things that can be used for matzah, right? And this is the category of all the things that can be chametz. They overlap perfectly. And this should have used the other color. Stuff we avoid on Pesach is the category of all the stuff we end up avoiding on Pesach, which means there are lots of things we don't eat on Passover or that we try to get rid of or we try to remove, and we'll talk about some of the reasons why. That is a much bigger category than the actual category of things that can become chametz. Because the actual things that can become literal chametz and violate the commandment is only these 5 grains. How are we doing on that? Right, so you cannot make chametz out of corn. You cannot make chametz out of beans. You cannot make chametz out of rice. However, as I look around at the Ashkenazim in the room, Ashkenazim certainly aren't eating corn, beans, and rice on Pesach. Why not? If they can't become chametz?
Because it's starch.
Nope. This is not a cooking chemical issue.
Ingredients.
Nope.
Well, the reason most of us don't eat it is because it's come down as the tradition that we're not supposed to eat it.
Okay, so there is definitely the minhag, what we call minhag avotenu, the customs of our ancestors, that for many people is the primary reason why they don't. But it's always important to understand where the minhag came from, because there are certain halachic considerations that will depend upon the origin of the minhag. In this particular case, the minhag began from an oops, or a worry of oops, right? So in the classical world, that is to say the Middle Ages and onwards, there was a real issue of mixing different types of flour. You had bean flour, you had rice flour, you had corn flour eventually, and it was very easy once you realized that other types of flour look different than that beautiful pure white purified wheat flour that we're used to, that it really is possible to mix up, especially in a casual home setting, multiple types of flour where they get intermingled. And now all of a sudden I'm using my bean flour. I think it's bean flour. Was that the barley flour? Or did I use the wrong scoop and there's still some barley left over with it and it got mixed in with the bean flour? You know, it's better not to use the bean flour at all. Just better not to use the rice flour. Better not to use this. But you'll notice what I'm saying very, very clearly here is flour. Nobody ever confused a bean with wheat. That mistake doesn't happen. And indeed, for many, many years in different communities, eating the full version of the food was perfectly fine. Indeed, Sephardim do to this day. Because why wouldn't I eat a full piece of bean when I know for a fact that that bean has not been through any processing that has, nowadays, a worry of a chametz susceptible product that's been used in the processing of it? You know, was there a wheat-based release agent used on the cooking press that made the bean cake that I made? That's a worry in the modern world, but in the classical world, if it was beans, it was beans. As long as it wasn't bean flour, it was fine. If it was corn syrup, it was considered fine, because nobody's going to confuse corn syrup with wheat. It's just, that doesn't happen. Again, in the modern world, processing, you still want to look for the hechsher for Passover, because processing can introduce things that are unseen, invisible ingredients and whatnot. But the whole process, the whole product of the whole identifiable, easily seen visual product itself is not chametzable, and therefore technically is not a violation. Now, keeping the minhag of our ancestors, that's a whole nother question of keeping that as well. But I want to make sure that we understand when we define chametz, that we are dealing with a very limited category of substances. And when it comes to cleaning, by the way, that definition of chametz stands. Right? If you have a pot that you only cook beans in all year round, you never cook anything that has any of the 5 grains in it, come Passover time, do you have to clean the pot? No. Can you use the pot? Not if you're Ashkenazic. Not if that's part of your custom. Right, now, if you're Sephardic, or if you've never were raised in a family that had the Ashkenazic custom, even though you are Ashkenazic, no problem as well. You have to make sure that it's clean and all of that, but it's not an issue of chametz anymore, because chametz has never touched the pot, only beans have. If you want a practical implication of this, you are an observant Jew living in Eretz Israel, in the land of Israel, and you're Ashkenazic and your neighbor is Sephardic. He invites you over for lunch during Passover. Can you eat in his house? You know, during Passover, he eats beans. You don't eat beans. You know that his pots cook beans. Your pots that cook beans have been put away for the week. Can I go to his house, eat on his plate, eat from his pots? Things that aren't beans. Absolutely yes. Absolutely yes. The Ashkenazic rabbis in Israel have said very, very clearly, it's not chametz. You shouldn't eat his beans. You don't go to his house and have his beans, but you don't have to worry about the fact that his beans have been on the plate. That doesn't make the plate treif with chametz for Pesach. It just means you shouldn't eat beans. All right, so this really does have practical implications for how we observe Passover, and in that particular case, very real implications for the ability for all of Israel, Am Yisrael, to celebrate together in a way that doesn't tear us apart. Okay, so 5 categories of grain make matzah, 5 categories of grains make chametz, but there is more that's been added as a protective measure that we are careful of on Pesach. That's the short of it. Good? Good. And what else do we need to fulfill the obligation? Hold on to your hats.
And they fulfill the obligation with demai, with first tithe whose terumah has been separated, and with second tithe or sanctified property which have been redeemed.
Okay. Everybody got that? All right. What is demai? What's first tithe with truma separated? What's second tithe? So I'm not going to go into all the details of the different categories of tithing, but let's start at the top, right? So the basic sanctified property. This is something that I have declared was going to be sanctified, and then I have decided it's not appropriate to sanctify it, and so I have redeemed it. While it is sanctified, and this loaf of bread for the temple, right? I've declared this loaf of bread is for the temple, or this loaf of matzah for the temple. Let's be careful. We're in Pesach. This loaf of bread, this loaf of matzah for the temple. Now it's Passover. Can I do the mitzvah of matzah with that loaf of matzah?
I would think no.
No, exactly right. Because who does it belong to? To the priest, to the temple, right? However, if I say this loaf of matzah for the temple, oops, I mean, no, not this one, that one. I can redeem this one. There's a penalty that goes along with it. And once it's been redeemed, absolutely I can use it for the mitzvah. Right? So that's the easiest one to sort of get our head around. While it's sanctified, it doesn't belong to me, therefore I can't do the mitzvah. When it's redeemed, it belongs to me again, now I can do it. Good? Good. Similarly, tithing, first tithe and second tithe, which were different tithes in different times during the 7-year cycle of the sabbatical. Just because I have taken the tithe, if I haven't separated from it the truma that's supposed to be dedicated to someone else, to Kohanim, remember we talked about truma last week? This was the food gift that was given over to the priests. If I haven't taken the truma out, then I don't get to use it, right? It's reserved. Even though I know, this is my bundle of tithe, even though I know that there's going to be a little blip, let's make the circles make sense, down here called truma. If I haven't removed the truma, I can't just reach into the sack and pull out wheat and use it to make matzah, because some of that wheat might belong to the priest, because I haven't taken the truma out. As soon as I take the truma out and put it in its own little bag, the rest of it's fine. All right, truma's that's been taken. Now I've differentiated. This is this is that, and it becomes available. But what happens if my neighbor has food that I get from him? He sells me some extra grain. And I know my neighbor, he's not exactly what you'd call religious. Maybe he's not always so careful with the tithing. So maybe he hasn't done the tithe from his food before he sold me the food that I'm eating. Can I use food that has a doubtful tithing pedigree? That is to say, I'm not sure that the person I got it from had tithed it. And that's what we call demai. Right? Demai is food that has a doubtful tithing pedigree. There's no provenance to establish for me clearly that a tithe had been taken from this. Think of it like you go to the swap meet, and there's somebody there who has a lovely stereo, car stereo, and it's got even all the wires hanging off the back of it. Perfect. It's almost as though someone had just pulled it from the dash of a car. Right? Back in the day when that used to happen a lot. Can I use that stereo? I don't know that it's stolen, but I maybe think it might be stolen. And I remember, eating something that wasn't properly tithed is akin to stealing. And so I would be a little hesitant. And I might, want to run the serial numbers and make sure that it's not coming to a police report or something like that for the stereo. Can't run serial numbers on food. Serial numbers, grain, cereal. Sorry. Oh, long day. So what do we do with demai? And this is a debate within the rabbinic system generally. And the rabbis generally say, I'm going to erase that so I have a little more room. Say that demai is prohibited until you take a tithe from it yourself. Right? So you tithe on top of the doubtful tithe. Right? So you get 10 pounds worth of whatever, you're going to take 1 pound out of it because you're not sure that the pound was taken from it by the original owner. Right? So until you do that, the demai is off limits. Except unless you are poor. If you are poor but pious, you can eat demai, this doubtfully tithed produce, without taking an additional tithe from it. Why?
Because you're poor.
Because you're poor. Exactly, because you need every bit of food you could get. Yeah. And having this extra stringency as a requirement for the poor would be very, very painful. And so the sages said, this is a doubt about what someone else might have done. Not me. If I didn't tithe it, I have to tithe it. I don't get to eat all of my food even if I'm poor. Right? If I'm poor, I still have to tithe my food and give it to other poor people and give it to the Kohanim and Levites and such. But if someone else sells me food and I'm poor, and I don't know for a fact that they tithed, but they might have, I'm exempt from adding this additional demai precaution on top of that. The rest of us who can afford it, yeah, we go ahead and say, I'll just be careful and take the extra top, take it off the top and we'll be okay. When it comes time for matzah, something is demai. Can you do the mitzvah of matzah with demai? What did the Mishnah say?
It just says yes.
It says yes. And the question is, everyone or just the poor? And the general consensus is everyone. That for matzah in particular, this is okay. No? Why? What do we call matzah? What's its nickname? It's a special type of lechem.
Lechem oni.
Lechem oni, which means?
Food of the poor.
Bread of the poor.
Bread of the poor. Yeah.
Bread of the poor. So we are all poor when it comes to matzah. Right? So we are all poor. That's what we say. This is the bread of affliction. It's not actually the bread of affliction in English. I know that's what all the Haggadot say. It literally is, this is the bread of the poor. This is the bread of the downtrodden. Right? And when we eat matzah, we are them. Indeed, one can even get access to demai, even if you're rich, by simply giving up all your possessions. Right? So you can have access to demai by simply saying, I own nothing. Everything I own, I no longer own. Now I can eat the demai. For Pesach, it's almost as that is happening for all of us as we are re-experiencing the poverty that our ancestors had in order to re-experience the joy of liberation. And so for the mitzvah of matzah, demai works for everyone. Now, This isn't really an issue in the modern world, but it is kind of important to understand for the Mishnah.
The Israeli men I've dated that said they're non-religious, every single one of them I've dated, they're kosher to the T.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they're more kosher than the people that are religious.
So, well, first of all, when I say not religious, I'm talking about in the ancient world, not about the modern world.
Oh,
Because
okay.
the Mishnah was written almost 2,000 years ago. So it's definitely not trying to make any statement about modern people. And second, the rabbis were aware that the laws of tithing were observed sometimes differently than other mitzvot. So someone might keep kosher because that was just what Jewish people did, but they might not be what the rabbis would call scrupulous when it came to doing the tithing. Maybe they weren't really as careful as they were supposed to be. And so the issue of demai was a very real one for their world, because if you weren't knowledgeable, if you weren't learned, or if you at least didn't ask for help, then it was really easy to mess up the whole tithing process. I mean, you can see we just went through the surface of it and it's already confusing. So the rabbis were aware that lots of people might be making mistakes on this, not because they were being deliberately irreligious, although some would, but more because people just sometimes made mistakes. And so the rabbis put in this extra precaution for themselves, but they didn't want their precaution to afflict the poor. And when it came time for Pesach, that created this very interesting little lechem oni and demai overlap for the fulfillment of matzah.
Like the rabbis would say, they put extra fence around.
Indeed they did, but they don't want the fence to hurt the poor. They need, you still don't get to eat chametz if you're poor. You still shouldn't be eating that, but this, which was an extra precaution, could be lowered in recognition of the needs of the poor. Does that make sense? Right? We don't lower the mitzvah, but we can lower the extra precautions. Okay. Part 3. Now that was 20 minutes on 2 parts.
And priests can fulfill their obligation with challah and truma.
All right, so that part's kind of obvious. So unless you don't know what challah is, which maybe we don't, most of us, when we think of challah, we're thinking of lovely loaves of bread for Friday night. That's not, I mean, that is challah, yes, but that's not the technical term challah that's used by the Mishnah. So the mitzvah of challah, as opposed to the byproduct or consumer product of challah, the mitzvah of challah is to take a portion from the dough that you are making, and that portion is meant to be a gift to the Kohanim. Nowadays, most of us don't have Kohanim to give it to, and so we simply destroy it because it doesn't belong to us, so we're not allowed to benefit from it, and we don't want it to, because it has a semi-sacred status, we don't want it to be misused, and so we simply dispose of it. But of course, in the old world, when we had Kohanim aplenty, that piece of dough that we took off of our larger chunk would be given to a Kohen.
Without being cooked.
Well, yeah, it's not cooked yet because it's from the dough, exactly. And the Kohen can do matzah with that chunk. So I'm making my big batch of matzah, and I've got my big lump of dough, and I take off the piece, and I say the mitzvah, the blessing for that. I turn over, because there can't be a lot of delay when we're making matzah, and there's a Kohen right there, and I say, here, this is yours. And he makes it into matzah, cooks it real fast. That night, he can use that for his Seder and do the mitzvah of matzah with the challah. And so too with truma. I bring him a sack of grain and I say, this is the truma that I'd like to give to you, Mr. Kohen. He says, thank you very much. He can grind it, use it for flour, and boom, he's off for the matzah. Make sense? That part's pretty straightforward. But part 4.
But not with untithed produce, nor with first tithe whose truma has not been separated, nor with second tithe or sanctified property which have not been redeemed.
Right. So again, he can't have the things that are not already properly categorized. Now, even though many of the things that are not categorized here, what's the right term? Even though some of the things that are not categorized here would end up eventually coming to him, right? So let me give you a quick example.
Was this the priest who
Yes.
said cannot do it with untithed produce?
Correct. right? So even though the tithe of that produce is going to end up with them, depending upon which of the tithes we're talking about, they can't eat from the produce until the tithe has been taken, right? Because it's technically not all theirs. They are going to get a portion of it, but they don't know which portion until the tithing has actually taken place. So just as I can't use it, so too they can't use it. Does that make sense? A little bit?
Yes.
Okay. Then let's get to the real head scratcher.
Okay. Number 5, loaves of the Thanksgiving offering and the wafers of a Nazarite.
Which are both matzah, right? These are things that are brought as unleavened bread. When you read through the Torah and talks about what is brought for these sacrifices, it is matzah.
A, if he made them for himself, they cannot fulfill the obligation with them.
Right? So if I made these matzahs in order to bring for the Thanksgiving offering or because I was a Nazir, the special Nazirite vow, if I made these loaves for that, I can't use them for Pesach at the Seder. On the other hand,
if he made them to sell in the market, they can fulfill their obligation with them.
All right, but if I was making them to sell them and they don't sell, then I can use it for my Seder. Right? Even though I was making them with thinking that I would probably end up selling them to people who would use them for the Thanksgiving offering or for the Nazirite vow offering, I didn't sell them, and now I have the Seder to come to, I can use them. So what's the difference?
The difference.
What's that?
Intent.
Intent is the short version. Judy, did you want to expand on that?
Yeah, if he's made it for the if I made matzah for a Thanksgiving offering, it's the same as if I've said this is for the temple.
Right. It has a designation. It has intent behind it. And the designation is rather specific. And it's not just that it's for the temple, it's also not for matzah. Right? So matzah is supposed to be made for the mitzvah of the Seder. It's not supposed to just be lying around. And so since these have very clear designations, the Thanksgiving offering, the Nazirite vow offering, they can't be repurposed. Something in the market, however, even though the seller may have in mind who he wants to sell it to, it's not his Thanksgiving offering, it's not his Nazirite vow offering, therefore they haven't been designated for those things. If he had designated them, he wouldn't be able to sell them. And therefore they are fungible. Right? Therefore he has in mind that if it doesn't sell for that, I can always use it for the Seder. Right? As a good merchant, you always have your backup plan of what you're going to do with your unsold merchandise. And therefore they are, well, fungible is really the best word. But again, it comes back to this notion that we've hit again and again and again, and I'm sure we will come across more times, intent matters. Right? What we think about the world changes it. Right? When I think on this loaf, Nazirite loaf, it has a different status. And when I think over here, I'm going to sell you in the marketplace, it has a different status. The loaves are identical. There's no chemical analysis on earth that can tell the difference. You can't weigh them to find the difference. There's no way to tell other than what was I thinking when I had the loaf and when I made it, or when I made the loaf and when I had it.
You gave it purpose.
I gave it purpose. Exactly right. And intentionality of the actor is huge in Judaism. Right? It is not purely a mechanistic system. This is not push button A and light B comes up. It's, well, what do you want to happen when you push button A? And then it'll be light B or C, depending upon what you wanted with the button. Right? It's not in one-to-one relationship. It's not one to whatever you feel like. Right? Judaism does have rules, obviously, but the rules follow intention as much as they follow some objective measure. There's a blending here. Make sense? Maybe? Okay. One Mishnah down, only 4 more to go. Chapter 2, Mishnah 6. Prepare to have your Seder changed again. And also prepare to reach the limits of my botany.
And these are the herbs with which one discharges his obligation on Pesach. With lettuce, chazeret, with chicory, olshin, with wild chicory, tamka, with picridium, parhavina, and with sanchus, maror.
All right, what in the world are we talking about here?
Maror.
Maror,
Yeah.
right? So we have to eat a bitter herb on Pesach. Well, what counts as one of those herbs? Right, we just did the 5 grains for matzah, right? That was nice and clear because we know those grains. And now here they're saying, well, what are you going to do your bitter herb with? What do you notice isn't on the list?
Anything sweet.
Well, anything sweet, obviously. But what do many Jews use in this country for Passover for maror?
Horseradish.
Horseradish.
Oh, yeah.
Not on the list.
So what does that mean?
What does that mean?
Because it's not spicy. It's spicy, but it's not bitter.
It's spicy but not bitter. It's also not an herb. It's a root. And yeah, far be it from me. You know you're in trouble when I begin a sentence like that. Far be it from me to say that you can't fulfill the mitzvah with horseradish, because many authorities obviously did. Many authorities who lived in areas where most of these things didn't exist found that horseradish was the best thing you could do in Western or in Eastern Europe, especially at this time of year when Passover would come at a time when Europe, especially Northern and Eastern Europe, wasn't exactly in full bloom yet. There weren't.
Be lucky if there wasn't 3 feet of snow on the ground.
Exactly. You know, Lithuania in the end of March, that's not the same as, you know, the land of Israel at the end of March. And so horseradish was something that had a very strong flavor. It wasn't comfortable to eat in quantity, and therefore it became a very common substitute. But the Mishnah is very clear, and the Talmud goes on in more detail, and Halakha is very clear. It's meant to be an herb, not a root. It's meant to be a bitter taste, not a spicy taste, not a hot taste. You know, there is a different word for spicy. You know, harif is a very different flavor in the palate of Hebrew, and horseradish is not bitter. So,
in fact, horseradish is a lot of chefs and people that cook in their homes. They use that to spice up their food for flavors.
right, they're not going to use it for bitterness. Exactly. And in fact, horseradish is used as a condiment in many places. Sometimes they'll tone it down a little bit, but they'll use it as a condiment. I know, you know, one of the things that I've inherited because my wife is British is when we have roast beef, horseradish is on the table as a condiment. It's not something that you eat and go, oh no! It's something that tastes really nice with the food. It tastes really nice. This isn't supposed to taste really nice. This is supposed to taste bitter, not painful, but bitter. And therefore, really the best you can do is to find a modern bitter plant to use. So certain types of lettuces you can still get that haven't been completely modified by farming and breeding to become only sweet, do still have a good bitter leafy taste to them. And that's usually what I would recommend to do the mitzvah with. Have horseradish on the table. Wonderful. Everybody loves horseradish. It's part of everybody's childhood, grew up with horseradish. I have horseradish for Passover on the table as well, but not for the actual mitzvah of maror. For the mitzvah of maror, it should really be a bitter, leafy substance.
Mustard.
I don't know that I've ever tried mustard or heard anybody speak specifically on mustard. Endives are usually what I use in my house. If you find a really particular sharp romaine, the heart of it can be quite bitter, but it's getting harder and harder because they keep getting waterier and waterier, more and more watery. And so they don't have as much of the bitter flavorness. Certain types of rocket and arugula has a bitter taste. But again, we've gotten really good at crossbreeding all of our lettuces and our herbs to get rid of the bitterness. And so finding an actual bitter one is a bit of a challenge these days. That's one of the burdens we bear of living in the modern world that doesn't like bitterness. But we are supposed to force ourselves to be bitter. Our ancestors didn't like bitterness either. They weren't doing this because it tasted good. They were doing it because it helped them remember what bitterness was for them as well. Okay.
I just have a question.
Yes.
I think I know what lettuce and chicory are, and I can guess wild chicory looks a lot like chicory, but the last two on the list I never heard of. Are they also some kind of green leaf?
Yes.
Presumably.
Yes. So if you look down in the commentary, you'll note that he talks about this Yehuda Felix, who did a very nice entry in the Encyclopedia Judaica, which tries to go into more detail of what we think these particular plants were. But really it's speculation. We're pretty sure on the chazeret being a type of lettuce, but apart from that, the others are educated guesses that are based upon what people can point to. Because once we left the land of Israel and we went off into both Babylon and then even more so into Europe, we're looking at a plant and saying, well, is that the same plant that we used to eat 200 years ago? I don't exactly have Wikipedia to look it up on. I don't even have a good book with a drawing of what the plant was. But it tastes bitter, so okay, we'll use that here. And then when the scholars from those generations moved on in other environs in Europe, etc., 1,000 years later, we're now able to go back to the land of Israel. Is this the same species that used to be, that inspired this chain that led to what we're eating in Europe? Or is this a different species? Or which one was it? Yeah, it's really, really hard, which is why settling on, and the Talmud goes into more detail that these are examples, that settling on a very, very bitter herb, that is to say actual leafy plant, that's what you want for your maror. And the specific botanical taxonomy is less important. If we can try these, if you can ever find me any Picridium, I would love to see what that tasted like. The Somchus doesn't sound good at all. Yeah.
Go look them up on Wikipedia.
Maybe they have them in one of the local botanical gardens, and they won't mind if we go by and take a few cuttings to sample them. Go, oh, that's terrible. Okay. Part two. Also, maybe of a bit of shock.
Part two, they fulfill their obligation whether they are moist or dry.
Right, that's the herb, right? The herb can be moist and fresh, or it can be a dried version of the herb.
But not preserved in vinegar, nor stewed, nor boiled.
Right, so why not?
It takes the bitterness.
Right, it changes the flavor,
Yeah.
right? You preserve it in vinegar, or you stew it and you boil it, and some amount of the flavor is going to be bled off during that process. How is most preserved horseradish made? It's a mixture of horseradish and vinegar, right? It's usually mixed, and oftentimes it has been boiled before it's grated, when it's turned into the condiment. So yeah, on many different marks, horseradish kind of fails to live up to the definition of maror. Onward.
Number three, and they combine to the size of an olive.
All right. Kazite, an olive's worth, is a very important measurement in Jewish law. And what they're basically trying to say is if you have a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B, a little bit of column C, but all together, you've got enough bitter herb that it makes an olive's worth, an olive size worth of bitter herbs, then you've done the mitzvah. Which means those people you may see who, for the mitzvah of maror, take the smallest amount of maror possible, you're not doing the mitzvah. Right? The mitzvah is to take at least an olive size worth. So when you find some nice leafy plant, you don't get to eat just a tiny little, 1 millimeter square of it. You got to sort of give it a little scrunch and see if it's about the size of an olive, and if it is, what? All at once. That's why you dip it in the charoset, right? Right. Well, the sandwiches we do eventually when we do the Hillel sandwich, as it's called, the Hillelowich. But the maror, again, another knock against horseradish. The maror has to be dipped in the charoset before you eat it, right? Dipped in the sweet paste. Have you ever tried to dip horseradish?
No, you have to take a piece of the fruit and slice it and pick up a slice.
Exactly.
We did one year.
Yeah. How well did that go?
It was very spicy.
Yeah, it was probably horrible. and so but a good leaf you can do, right? You can dip it in, it comes up, and you eat it, and then you get to have your bitterness tempered by the sweetness of the charosin, as it's supposed to be. Make sense? Okay. Part 4.
Part 4, and they fulfill their obligation with their stalks.
That is to say, even the stalk of the bitter plant, that's part of the cumulative measure of its size. So it's not like you have to eat just an olive's worth of leaf. It's leaf plus stalk. That's okay. That can add together to build up to the total.
And number 5.
Oh no.
And with
Yeah.
Demai, and with Demai, and with first tithe for which Truma has been separated, and second tithe and sacred property which have been redeemed.
Right. All of those are fine. So again, you can do the mitzvah of maror with any one of those categories. Make sense? Makes sense. Okay. Mishnah 7. Now we're going to get into some odd forms that chametz can get made.
Number 1, one may not soak bran for fowls, but one may scald it.
Okay, so apparently, again, what do I know about chickens? Or the kinds of domestic fowl that they had back then. Apparently, people would soak the bran of the wheat, the grain, as some form of food process for them. But if you soak it, what happens?
It's wet and it might possibly.
Eventually, the leavening process will start, right? So if you soak the bran and then try to feed it to your chickens, you've got a problem because you could be feeding them chametz, which, as we already talked about, you're not allowed to benefit from. It's not just about you not eating, it's also you can't benefit from it happening. Apparently, again, I'm not a big farmer, so I don't know this, but apparently if you throw the bran in boiling water, rather than just regular water, the boiling water will kill the fermentation process before it starts. And therefore, you don't have to worry about chametz. I don't know. What do I know from this?
Boiling water does kill yeast.
Well, there we go. So apparently, if you were to take like regular flour and throw it into the boiling water and then fish it out somehow, the doughy mass, you wouldn't really expect to see it to ever rise.
Well, if you leave it long enough
Well,
and it remains moist,
a few days.
Some wild yeast from the air.
Right. The good old wild yeast metaphor again, right? The yeehaw, wild yeast. Yeah.
I've made bread often enough, and if the water is too hot, you put your little yeast packet in the hot water, and if it's too hot, the yeast doesn't do anything.
Okay.
Because you've killed it.
So boiling water indeed can halt or prevent the fermentation process from continuing as normal. Right? There may be ways around it, but it definitely would interrupt the normal process. So
Yes.
I think the rabbis were onto something. Thank you for the confirmation from the real world, because what I know about cooking mostly comes from Mishnah, and that's not terribly useful, because we don't cook much like Mishnah used to cook. That's why Penelope does most of the cooking at home. It's very, very important. All right. Speaking of ladies.
A woman may not soak bran to take with her to the bathhouse, but she may rub dry bran on her skin.
All right. So again, apparently it was common to take bran as a cosmetic product, and you would soak it and use it on your skin.
What do we call it now? Exfoliating.
Right, exfoliating, or I've seen people with oatmeal on their face, that kind of thing. The oatmeal scrub and all of that. And just like now and then, you're going to get the wet. And if you get it wet and the leavening begins, then we've got a problem. Dry bran on skin, that's okay. Right? But in the bathhouse itself, no, chametz is going to be generated in this process, or at least we got a really good chance of chametz happening. Make sense? Okay. And for men?
And a man may not chew wheat and place it on his wound because it turns into chametz.
Right. So apparently, yeah. Okay, we'll talk about this for the moment.
So it was being used as a Band-Aid.
Oh, it is. It's being used. It is indeed. But there is an issue because we talked about so far, and the Mishnah hasn't mentioned this yet, but I might as well throw it in for just to confuse you. The 5 grains are needed to make chametz, but one other substance is also needed. Well, plus
Wheat,
Yeast.
yeast, yeah.
liquids. No, not yeast. The yeast is considered to be external, right? But certain liquids will work. And one of the liquids is saliva, right? And I know the thought of making a saliva loaf of bread is just horrid. But what they're pointing out, it's the same liquids that can activate susceptibility to ritual impurity. And so even if you wouldn't normally cook it, if it comes into contact with one of those liquids, then I think there's 7 of them, then it becomes susceptible to generating chametz. One of the liquids that's not on the list, juice. Juice doesn't cause chametz, which is why if you read a lot of old-time Jewish cookbooks, you will see lovely recipes for making cakes that are based on juice rather than based on water.
Like apple juice or orange juice?
Like apple juice or orange juice. And yeah, this is where we get to the technical definition of chametz that's different than the biological or culinary definition of rising. Because absolutely, juice will cause a fairly normal reaction in the flour as compared to water. It'll definitely have a different flavor and different tendencies when doing what it does. But leavening is not going to be prevented just because you use juice. But because the definition of liquid is the 7 liquids that can render an item susceptible to ritual impurity, say that 5 times fast, and juice is not on that list, technically one of the 5 mixed with juice won't equal chametz. Now, nowadays, most people don't use this particular leniency. Well, it's not a leniency. They don't use this particular fact of what makes something chametz, because no matter how much that cake made from wheat and orange juice isn't chametz, we just don't like the look of it, because that really looks like a cake, and it really tastes like a cake. When you're eating a potato cookie, you're really sure that's not what a cookie is supposed to be. But when you're eating an orange juice cake, it's really hard to know that that's not what a cake tastes like. They are very, very good and deceptive. In my youth, there was a friend of the family who was from the old school, who used juice all the time during Pesach to do all sorts of wonderful things in the kitchen. And this was long before I was keeping kosher in any way. But I'll tell you, when she laid out the cakes that went along with the matzah brei, I would not have said any one of those cakes wasn't as good as any cake I'd had in my life. There was no degradation of the product at the time. But technically, she was absolutely right. She was old school, and she was following the facts of chametz, and she was following it to the letter. And the letter said juice cake was okay, but saliva cake, not okay.
When it says a man, sorry. When it says, and a man may not chew wheat and place it on his wound, because it may turn into
Chametz, right?
But doesn't every rabbi say that due to any health issues, medical, you can break that?
Kind of. So, yeah. The rabbis of the Mishnah had a very different understanding of medical science. And their view of what was essential for health and what was just, sure, if you want to, is very different than what we now know from modern research and experimental discovery. So when we say if it is something that will help the body heal, that will help you get over a serious problem, like a wound or an illness, then by all means, that's fine. Their definition of what actually helped was really narrow. And so even though people may chew up wheat and stick it on their wounds, they were not giving you a dispensation because they were not convinced that was life-saving. And if it wasn't life-saving, then no, you don't get to break a known mitzvah for well, maybe this will do something good. And really, given the state of the medicine in their day, pretty much everything was kind of like, man, maybe this will work. Stick a leech on it. Here, let me bleed you a little bit. There was a maybe kind of sort of feeling about most of medicine at the time. And so I kind of understand why they were hesitant to just be handing out get out of jail free cards, don't worry about Pesach, don't worry about Shabbat, for all of these things, without some evidence that what they were doing, which would violate a known mitzvah, would have a known effect. So the answer is kind of yes and no. That is to say, in the modern world where we have a much better degree of confidence that the treatments that we are taking have a real impact on our health and to our benefit, then yes, it's much easier to say, do it, and don't worry about the fact that it's chametz because it has a real benefit. But in the ancient world, they were much more suspicious of the various treatments people had, with good reason. And so they did not hand out dispensations left, right, and center. It wasn't just, well, if you think it's going to help you, why not? They said, no. If it's definitely saving your life, like taking a sword out of your stomach, no problem. Or, picking up a stone off of someone's head, no problem. That they could see. Pulling a person out of a burning building, yes, absolutely. Break Shabbat, break Pesach, whatever you need. But, these other things, who knows if this helps, right? So no, they did not have the same willingness to supersede Shabbat or Pesach or other mitzvot for the medicine of their day.
What are the 7 liquids?
I'm trying to remember the whole list, and I don't have it off the top of my head. I'm sorry. So if you want, I can get that for you afterwards. I know that I have, because I was just looking at it the other day in preparation for today, and as I began to explain, I suddenly went, what? Wait, what are the 7 again? But I remember the important part, which was that saliva is one and juice isn't. Dew is another one of them. I believe that blood is another one of them. I'd have to go back and double check all of the ones.
Wine is okay?
Well, so the issue, I have to go back and double check on wine as well. But the issue is, let's imagine that you've got your lovely apple. When does the apple become susceptible to ritual impurity? Right? Because if it's just hanging on the tree, how do I know what's been touching it, what's been happening around it, what's going on with it? It may already be ritually impure. And so the rabbi said, well, no, first of all, you have to pick it. And second of all, it has to get wet. Before it's wet, it can't become ritually impure. And so then the definition of, well, what counts as wet becomes rather important. What liquids make wet that can then become ritually impure from. And so that's where the list and the discussion of it comes in. But that's a whole other section of Mishnah. Okay. Yeah, why not? Let's go ahead and finish off the last bit. We're on Mishnah 8. This is fairly straightforward-ish.
Mishnah 8, number 1. One may not put flour into charoset or into mustard.
Right. So you've got your charoset on the table, your paste. You can't sprinkle flour into it. Now I don't know, I should put it this way. I don't know anybody who takes Passover serious who keeps flour during Passover at hand. I mean, no one makes matzah for themselves these days. And even people who might make matzah for themselves aren't making matzah during Pesach. And so the flour has been sold or at least stored away somewhere out of sight. Ancient world, no, you were making matzah for yourself when you needed it. And so flour was something you had to have around. And putting flour into charoset, which was a food that wasn't only eaten at Pesach, but was just a normal condiment, was apparently a normal thing. Again, I don't know the general table manners of the ancient world, but putting the little flour into your charoset before you ate it was a thing. Not on Pesach. On Pesach, no sprinkling of flour into your charoset, or your mustard for that matter. However, part 2.
And if he did put it, it must be eaten immediately. But Rabbi Meir forbids it.
Right. So the idea here, of course, by the majority rule would be if you did put flour into it, if you eat it up real quick, there's no time for it to ferment. Right? You can't get the leavening action. So no worry, no harm, no foul. Rabbi Meir says no, you can't do it because the basic idea is you might be generating some amount of leavening immediately, and therefore no, definitely not. Most of us don't have flour, so again, not a big issue for us. But again,
Talking about mustard flour.
Perhaps. No, they're talking about if it was mustard flour, it's not one of the five, it can't make chametz. So again, it's just kind of a reminder that the style of living in the ancient world was a lot more what we would call lenient than now, what they would call normal. Because this was just the way they had to live. They had to keep their flour available. They had to be not as strict because they couldn't afford to be strict on so many things. It was just a part of the way they lived. The strictness we have around Passover now is a luxury of the wealthy. And remember, we are all rich compared to people who lived 2,000 years ago. Most of us live a much better life and a much better lifestyle than even some of the wealthy of the ancient world.
Number 3, one may not boil the Pesach sacrifice, neither in liquids nor in fruit juice, but one may baste and dip it in them.
Okay, we're going to come back to the whole Passover sacrifice and cooking of it. Again, part of the ancient world ritual that we don't have because we don't have the temple to do the sacrifice at. But this is just beginning the notion of what we mix and how we do the sacrifice. So hold your questions on this because we'll come back to the sacrifice in much more detail. And then part 4.
Part 4, the water used by a baker must be poured out because it causes leavening.
All right, so here's the question. I'm a baker, right? And we've got people here I know who know much more about baking than me, but this is what I understand happens when you're a baker, is you've got your flour and you've got your water and you mix the flour and water together to make your dough, right? And as you're going, you're probably, washing your hands from time to time. The flour is getting a little bit mucky. You maybe bring out a little extra. You add it to the dough as needed. That leftover flour water, that leftover baking water, what do you do with it? The dough you're cooking, right? The dough is becoming your matzah. But the schmutzy water, what happens? Throw it out.
You gotta get rid of it.
Exactly. It's potentially chametz in that water. Now, it's more water than flour, right? Because it's not dough. It's not meant to be dough. It's just kind of a tool of the trade that's sitting there on the table. But because of the potential for chametz in that, you have to pour it out. You can't even keep it around for other use. Because it might contaminate a new batch, which would then be a problem. Because then the new batch would already have flour that had been mixed for much longer than it should be to become matzah coming into contact with it, or B, you're benefiting from it and it has chametz in it, and that's a problem. Again, remember, this is during Passover because you'd be baking your challah or baking your matzah during Pesach for yourself. You didn't go and buy the 5-pound box at Winn-Dixie and then just eat the whole box throughout all of Passover and then 2 months later. You would make what you needed, usually for the day. And good. On that note, we finished chapter 2. Next week is our school staff meeting. So we will have a week off. And then we will meet again after that, and we'll be on chapter 3. Okay.
Rabbi.